Okay, so what we're going to do with this lecture, pardon me, is we're going to take that handout that you have that shows the epithelial and connective tissues, and we're going to look a little bit more closely at what the different types of tissues are and what roles they play. So let's start then with the epithelial tissues. Just real briefly, to summarize what we did earlier, these are covering protective tissues. Remember, these are the entrances and exits from the body, form surface glands. Every epithelial tissue has a free surface and a basement membrane. These are formed of a dense cellular structure, and these tissues are avascular. Okay? Now, when we look at epithelial tissues, we're going to distinguish the different types of epithelial tissues based on their cellular structure. And there's two characteristics that you want to look for. Two distinct characteristics. Let's start with the first one. The first characteristic is the number of layers of cells that you see in the tissue. Look at these two pictures that are up here. Notice that one of them has a single layer of cells and the other has 3 layers of cells, doesn't it? So this epithelial tissue is obviously thicker than that one. Which one do you think would provide more protection? The thicker one, of course. So I'd probably use a tissue like this for some sort of protection kind of thing, and I might use this kind of a tissue for if I needed minimal protection, but maybe I need to regulate things that are coming through the tissue, either entering or exiting the body. Right? Now, the way we're going to define the number of layers is with 2 basic words. A single layer of cells is going to be called a simple tissue. So if I have a simple epithelial tissue, it's 1 layer of cells. The great thing here is I don't have words for 2 or 3 or 4. It's just going to be 1 or more than 1. Okay, so the word we're going to use for more than 1 is stratified. Stratified. So 2 layers, 3 layers, 10 layers, 50 layers. If it's more than 1, it's stratified. Couple of pictures here show us those under the microscope. Here I have a bunch of tissue, but if you look very closely right here at the surface, there's a single layer of very, very thin cells. This layer right here is an epithelial tissue covering all of these other tissues underneath. Here I have a stratified type with many, many layers. All of this dark blue that you see here is epithelial tissue. Many, many, many layers covering and protecting this lighter blue tissue underneath. So if you're trying to identify, oh, it's this tissue or that tissue, the number one thing is how many layers do you see? If somebody pointed out that this little line that you see there was an epithelial tissue, you'd say, well, that's got to be a simple type. It doesn't look like it's any thicker than 1. Okay, so the first characteristic then is the number of layers. What's the second characteristic? Hang on. Got to do one more thing here. There is a third, I should mention this third layering type. Really, you want to think these two. This third one here is a very, very special type. You can see that the word stratified is in here, so that makes you think layers. But this prefix here, pseudo, is a Latin word that has a special meaning. You should know it. Anybody know what that means? It means false. It means not something. But more than that, the word pseudo has more meaning than just false. Anybody know Give me another synonym for pseudo. Pretend would work. If you're false and you're pretending, what are you? Fake, phony, right? Something that looks like the real thing, but it isn't. Some things that are false are blatantly false. You know they're not right. But something that looks like the real thing, but it isn't, is pseudo, fake. So if I am fake stratified, what would I be? You look like you are, but if you're not stratified, then you are simple, right? If I'm not stratified, then I'm simple. There's only two choices here. I'm either one layer or I'm more than one layer. If I'm a tissue that looks like I'm more than one layer, but I'm not, I'm really just a simple layer of cells, then I'm pseudostratified. Yeah, it would have to be sort of a tall cell, wouldn't it, to look like it was more than one layer. It couldn't be like some little simple thin layer of cells, right? Right. Okay, so in your handout, we've got under epithelial tissues, we have these three categories, right? We have these three categories, and you might want to write out here, this is the number of layers, is kind of what's being described there. Now, let's look at the second characteristic. The second characteristic is the shape of the cells themselves. It turns out that epithelial cells come in one of three shapes. So I've got three layering patterns, and now I'm going to have three shapes of cells. The first shape is what we call squamous. Squamous. The A in here sounds like an A. Squamous cells are flat cells. Here's our picture in your textbook, the artist's drawing. Squamous cells are flat. It's almost like, we don't say squamous, but we have a root word that's kind of like that. We say something is squashed. If something is squashed, what is it? It's flattened, right? Same root word in the Latin. So what is this tissue now? If I use my layering and my shape names, what is this? How many layers is it? Okay, so it's simple. Cell shape, squamous, right? And the term we use for all epithelial tissues, epithelium. So if I'm naming this tissue right here, it's simple, squamous epithelium. Got it? Okay, so this is one of the cell shapes. Let's look at a second one then. Okay, we had squamous. The second one is what we call cuboidal. The term is cuboidal. Now let's look at what cuboidal cells look like. Okay, are these flat like the squamous ones? No. You do need to be careful with the word cuboidal, though. The cuboidal word kind of carries a box-like structure, right? And the artist actually drew this row of cells sort of box-like. But please don't think they have to have corners on them. Okay, the key idea of a cube is that it's equidimensional, isn't it? Right? Balls are also equidimensional, like a basketball or a volleyball is equidimensional. Look at the picture right here. Okay? The picture right there shows two rows of cells that are cuboidal. What this actually is a tube. This is a tube in the kidney. In fact, these cells right here are the distal tubule epithelial cells, right? One of those 8 cells you studied for the quiz. That's what these are. And picture if I had a pipe or a tube and I cut it lengthwise and took half of it off, what would you see? You'd see the two cut edges, wouldn't you? And that's what you're seeing here. Here's the inside hollow part of the tube, and here are the two edges where it was cut. And I see these rows of cuboidal cells, meaning that they're equidimensional. They're not flat, right? Everybody with me? Got the concept there? So we're going to use the word cuboidal. So if I was going to write the name of this tissue, what would I write? Simple, because it's one cell later. Cuboidal, name of the shape of the cell, and then I would put the word epithelium on there. Got the idea? Okay. Now, there's a third shape. We have squamous and cuboidal now. What is the third shape? Third shape is called columnar. Third shape is columnar. Let's look at what they look like. Okay, here are columnar cells. Okay, again, you see a row of cells sitting above some connective tissue under here. There's a basement membrane. These tissues have all of the basic characteristics, but now the cells are very tall. Much taller than they are wide. And they don't have to be very tall. These look like they're about 3 or 4 times. They might just be twice as tall as they are wide. But if they're any taller than they are wide, they're columnar cells. So how would I write the name of this now? I would call it what? Simple, columnar, epithelium, right? This is how you do all epithelial tissues. You write down how many layers it is, you write down the shape of the cell, and you write the word epithelium. It's not real difficult. When you know the layering patterns, and then you know the 3 shapes of the cells, it's pretty straightforward. Now, there are a couple of things that you should know about columnar cells besides just their shape. In the columnar type tissues, we also typically find what we call goblet cells. Goblet cells produce mucus. So in the picture here, you see a couple of cells that look different than the others. Over in this picture, the ones that have these pink stains in them, the mucus is stained pink in those pictures. And you can see there's a couple of places where there are cells that are producing mucus. These other cells are just doing their barrier thing, but these other goblet cells are producing mucus. So all mucous membranes in your body are columnar epithelia. And the size of the cells and the mucus provide a double barrier to the outside world. Where would you typically find these, do you think? Okay. Lining of the digestive tract. Lots of bacteria and microbes and things come through your digestive tract. So you want a thicker, you don't want many layers because you don't want a huge boundary. You've got to get nutrients through this membrane, right? But you want a taller type cell like this, and then the cell is going to produce mucus to help trap those things. Where else? Where would be another obvious one? Yeah, sinus, air passages, right? Respiratory system, lungs, breathing tubes, right? I'm breathing in lots of microorganisms every day with the air that I'm breathing. I want to keep those things out of me. So you'll find this same sort of columnar pattern there. The other characteristic that we see at times with columnar epithelium is what we call cilia. If you look at, this is sort of the same picture, you can see some mucus goblet cells here. But notice right up here on the free surface, there's sort of a fringe up there. If you look at the microscopic picture over here, you can see the upper border of the cell, and you can see a little fringe there. It's not sort of fuzzy, but you can see it. And it's little like bristles that stand up. Sometimes the cells need to move fluids. This is especially true of the columnar epithelium in your respiratory system. Respiratory system is a dead-end sac. It's not a tube running through your body from one end to the other. Everything that goes in has got to come back out the same way it went in. So as dust and dirt and microbes get down into your respiratory tract, how do you get them up and out? You may cough, right. But unbeknownst to you, other than coughing, having to do the coughing thing, all day long, every day, these cilia right here are pushing the mucus up, 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 up to your throat, and all day long you're swallowing. You're not aware of your breathing, you're not aware of your blinking, and you're not aware of your swallowing. You're swallowing little bits of mucus all day long that is coming up and out of your respiratory system. Okay? And it's these cilia that do that. This is, if you want to get into the, all of the thing about smoking, some of the chemicals in smoke then poison these cells. The cilia don't work, and the mucus sort of collects down in there, and that's why people that have smoked for a while do a lot of coughing, because they've got to get that stuff up and out of their lungs because they've poisoned the cells that do it naturally for them. Now, one of the things that you see here too is this is the columnar tissue that we call pseudostratified, right? Pseudostratified does not come in squamous because the cells are too flat. Even cuboidal cells are not tall enough to look like they're more than one layer. But columnar cells are so tall here that it can appear to be two layers. And basically what you see here is the cells are so tightly squeezed together, they're not of a uniform width. And so in some of the cells, their nuclei may fall down here near the basement membrane. Other nuclei may be squeezed up here near the free surface. And with more than one sort of layer of nuclei, it looks like, if you put it under a microscope, it almost looks like, because there's several nuclei, it looks like separate cells, one above the other. So when you see tightly packed cells and you see nuclei all over the place, you'd look at that and you'd say, well, either it's a columnar epithelium, pseudostratified, or it's, several different cells up on each other in layers. One of the things that gives this away right away is the fact that you see goblet cells there too, though. You will always see that with simple columnar epithelium. And remember that pseudostratified is really simple, isn't it? It's not stratified. So that's the type. This is what we call pseudostratified columnar epithelium, right? And we actually do have some simple columnar epithelium, not pseudostratified, but just simple, that have cilia on them. Like in a woman, the cells that line the fallopian tubes are just simple columnar epithelium, but they have a layer of cilia. The cilia are what move fluids through the tube so that the egg gets from the ovary to the uterus. Right? They beat. The little egg does not have any swimming properties. You have to have a current of fluid flowing through the tube that kind of carries it along like an inner tube on a river. Right? And the little egg just rides the current of fluid, but the current is created by the cilia that are there. It also explains why women that smoke have more tubal pregnancies than women that do not smoke, because the same poisons that poison the cilia here get into the bloodstream, circulate through the body, and poison the cilia in the reproductive tubes. And so if they're not creating a current of fluid, the egg may not get to the uterus when it's time to implant. It may have gotten fertilized in the fallopian tube, and then if there's not a good current of fluid, it implants in the tissues of the fallopian tube, which were never meant to carry a baby to full term, and so you have that kind of problem. That doesn't mean if you smoke, you're going to have a tubal pregnancy. But if you look at the statistics, if you look at the odds, women that smoke have more tubal pregnancies than women that do not smoke. So, two types of columnar. And if you look at your handout, right, you'll notice that under the pseudostratified category, there's only columnar here, right? These other two types are not thick enough to mask themselves or to pretend to be a stratified type of tissue. And then notice that when you have columnar types, you have ciliated and non-ciliated types of those. Okay, lastly, let's look then at the stratified types. Okay, and we have a stratified type for each one of our shapes. So stratified squamous epithelium. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, here's a picture, and right away, do you see that there's more than one cell there? So if you were writing the name of this, the first thing you'd write is stratified, of course. Now look closely at the cells and tell me what shape they are. Are they all squamous? Okay, this is all tissue. This is all epithelial tissue from here to here. This is connective tissue. There's the basement membrane. What do the cells down here look like? These look squamous? They look cuboidal, right? Squamous is flat. These are little boxes down here, little cuboidal cells. What's going on? Why do I call this squamous, right? I'm going to call this stratified squamous, but why do I call it that if I see all these cuboidal cells? Well, just stop for a minute and think what's going on here. Where do all these layers come from, do you think? Where do all the layers in this stratified tissue come from, do you think? Costco? Do cells get added on? Does something come along and add cells to the outside of this? From where? From, yeah, okay. All of these other layers are coming from the layers right here at the bottom. Right? Picture that the only job of these cells down here at the bottom is to multiply. You know, some cells are manufacturers. Some cells perform functions like contraction. Cells have all sorts of different roles to play. All these cells down at the bottom here do is multiply. They're like little rabbits, right? Just generating, just making more and more and more cells, right? What happens to the cell? Every cell makes other cells by dividing into two. If I'm a cell, I grow bigger, and then I divide myself in half. I grow bigger, and then I divide myself in half, and I keep making more cells by division. So that's where all these other cells come from, right? As these cells are multiplying, those cells get pushed up, right? And so all of these cells are going closer and closer to the surface, right? Now, what happens? Well, these cells are going to live just fine because they're right next to, remember the epithelial tissues are avascular, no blood vessel. So where's all the moisture? Where's all the nutrients? Down here in the connective tissues under these cells. So these cells live fine, right? But as they get pushed farther and farther and farther away from the source of life, what happens? They begin to die. They begin to dry up. And as they dry up, they flatten, right? And so the oldest cells are where? At the top. These are the oldest, most mature cells. And so when we name a stratified type, we always name it by its mature cells. If the cells at the surface that are becoming mature are flat, we're going to call it stratified squamous epithelium. Does that make sense? See how that works? And that's what you see here. Here's sort of an undulating base of cuboidal cells, but the cells up here at the surface are flat. This is your skin. The epidermis, the outside surface of your skin, is stratified squamous. These are the dead skin cells on the surface that provide that barrier to the outside world. This is why moisture stays in. Right? You have oil glands that coat this with oil, and so all of this, all of the moisture stays in your body because you've got many, many, many layers of protection. What happens to these dead skin cells? They just kind of flake off. Yeah, they're flaking off all day long, right? They flake off into your clothes. They flake off. Do you know where most house dust comes from? Do you dust your furniture? Dead skin cells. 80% of all house dust is dead skin cells. The more people that live in your house, the more dust you have. Okay? Now, if you take lots of showers, then a lot of those skin cells wash down the drain through the shower, right? But that's where these skin cells ultimately go. They're flaking off all the time. All right. So, a second type is stratified cuboidal then. Okay, and what I see here is several layers. This typically doesn't have as many layers as like the stratified squamous. This is usually 2 or 3 layers, but more than one layer is stratified, right? The shape of the cells at the surface are still cuboidal. And this tissue is an epithelium. So this is how you name it. And I bet you could tell me now what my next one's going to look like, right? Stratified columnar, what's it going to look like? Right. Are the ones at the bottom going to be long? No, the ones at the bottom are going to be cuboidal, but when I look at the surface of the layers, I see that the layer at the surface is tall columnar cells. So this is a stratified, right? Stratified columnar epithelium. Got it? Got the idea then? So this little diagram is meant to sort of diagram out all the different possibilities here. I can have the 3 stratified types, I can have this one pseudo-stratified type, and I have this very simple types. For some of you, this diagram here makes more sense than a bunch of sentences in notes, doesn't it? Some of you, if you're not finding success taking notes by writing bunches of sentences of what I say in class, some of you may need to take what I'm saying and make a diagram, something like this. Say, these things belong to this. Here's the big main concept we're talking about. Here are the elements of it. Here are the other elements that are tied into those, and make a diagram for yourself. If things don't work for you, if the way you study or the way you take notes or whatever isn't working for you, be intelligent. Try something different. Right? This is an example of one of those things. Okay, now let's turn our attention to connective tissues. Give me a